think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North all talking about rights, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. Ain't I a woman? Mm-hmm. Look at me. Look at my arms. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man can head me.
This is the life story of a poor woman who was never supposed to speak, but somehow made the world listen. Born into slavery, denied education, stripped of family and freedom, Sojourner Truth rose to become one of the most powerful voices of the 19th century. She couldn't read or write, yet she challenged presidents, packed lecture halls, and delivered words that still echo across generations. With pure will and relentless resolve, Sojourner Truth became a force that shook the foundations of slavery, patriarchy, and power itself, leaving behind a legacy carved not by privilege, but by truth. So if you're ready to hear how she rose from the shadows and changed history, give this video a like to show your support and join us as we begin her remarkable story. Around the year 1797, on the rolling land of the Hardenberg estate in Swartakill, Ulster County, New York, Isabella Baumfree entered life not as a person, but as property. She was one of 13 children born to James and Elizabeth Baumfree, both enslaved by Dutch-descended colonists whose hold on the Hudson Valley had not yet loosened, even as the United States began calling itself a Republic of Freedom. The Baumfrees spoke Dutch at home, a legacy of New York's colonial roots, where slavery had been legal under the Dutch West India Company and continued under British rule. Isabella's first language, the tongue she cried in, prayed in, and heard whispered between her mother's lips, was not English. Her earliest memories were shaped by a world where Black people labored under white masters who still carried the accents and assumptions of European feudalism. Freedom for Isabella was not even a concept. It was simply not a word that existed in the rooms where she slept or the fields where she worked. The suffering came early. Isabella would later recall the pain of being sold like a tool, a transaction without tenderness. At the age of 9, she was torn from her mother's arms and sold for a mere $100, along with a flock of sheep, to a cruel man named John Neely. That price, set by a white man's hand, marked the first time Isabella's life was given a number. Neely was violent, erratic, and utterly merciless. He beat her until the scars became familiar. He mocked her when she couldn't understand his English, then punished her for not responding quickly enough. She had no kin nearby, no one to cry to in the dark. For a child raised in the fragile safety of her mother's presence, this was a brutal and bewildering exile. She was sold again and again. From Neely, she passed to a tavern keeper named Shriver in Port Ewan, where she served drinks and scrubbed floors. And then in 1810, she was sold to John Dumont, a farmer in West Park, New York. Dumont was not a stranger to violence, and neither was his wife. Under their household, Isabella became a body without boundaries. Dumont's wife taunted her with small, cutting humiliations, but it was Dumont himself who left the deepest wounds. He violated Isabella repeatedly. He claimed dominion not just over her labor, but over her womb. Her body became a contested space, used, abused, and denied its own sanctity. In the midst of this torment, a flicker of human connection arrived in the form of a young man named Robert, enslaved on a neighboring farm. He and Isabella fell in love quietly, tenderly, in stolen moments far from watchful eyes. But even love had no protection under slavery. When Robert's master learned of the relationship, unauthorized and unapproved, he had the young man beaten nearly to death for stepping outside the invisible line of control. Robert never recovered. Isabella was forced to let go of the only person who had looked at her and not seen property. Years later, she would still whisper his name, "My Robert." But there was no time to mourn. Dumont arranged her marriage, as slaveholders did, to a man she did not choose, an older enslaved man named Thomas, already worn by years of labor. Their union was not a joining of hearts, but a pairing of assets. Isabella bore 2 children under that arrangement. The first, a son named James, died in infancy. The second, a daughter named Diana, was not Thomas's child, but Dumont's, fathered in violence, in one of the many moments when Isabella's consent was irrelevant. By the age of 18, Isabella had already known more pain than many do in a lifetime. She had buried a child, lost her love to brutality, and carried in her arms a daughter who reminded her of every indignity she had endured. But she had also begun to sharpen something inside herself, something hard to name, yet impossible to crush. She was not yet Sojourner Truth. That name would come later, a name she would forge herself. But the seeds of that transformation were already rooted in the soil of her suffering. She listened, she observed, she endured, and she did not break. Isabella's journey had only just begun, but even now, enslaved and bound by every law and tradition around her, she was already walking a path few could see, a path toward freedom and toward a voice that would echo through history. The years that followed Isabella's forced marriage to Thomas, marked by unrelenting labor, fleeting hope, and the slow unraveling of what little control she had over her life and children. Slavery not only claimed her body, but also her family. With each child she bore, Isabella understood more deeply how easily her motherhood could be erased by a master's whim or a trader's offer. It was not a question of if her family would be torn apart, but when. New York's legal landscape by then had begun to shift. The gradual abolition laws passed in 1799 and expanded in 1817 laid out a cold, bureaucratic countdown to freedom. All children born to enslaved women after July 4th, 1799, were to serve extended indentures into their mid-20s before being emancipated. Those born before the deadline would technically be freed by July 4th, 1827. But the law was only as strong as the men who obeyed it, and most slaveholders in the state had no interest in giving up unpaid labor early. They stalled, evaded, and sold people south before freedom could arrive. John Dumont, Isabella's owner, had promised her something rare, freedom 1 year early, in 1826, if she continued to work hard. For Isabella, that was a lifeline. She worked tirelessly. She trusted him. She hoped. But when the year came, Dumont changed his mind. He rescinded the promise without remorse. Her years of obedience, her silence, her endurance, none of it was enough to secure her freedom. The betrayal was sharp, and it brought her to a decision. Isabella planned with calm resolve. On a cold November night in 1826, with winter pressing in and time running out, she wrapped her infant daughter Sophia in blankets and slipped out of Dumont's house. She carried no money, no supplies, only her baby and the full weight of desperation. She walked north through the dark woods toward the tiny hamlet of New Paltz, where she had heard whispers of a Quaker couple who might help. Isabella and Sophia found refuge with Isaac and Maria Van Wagenen, abolitionist Quakers who did not just offer her shelter, they acted. When Dumont discovered her whereabouts, the Van Wagenens paid him compensation for what he claimed was her remaining service, neutralizing his legal claim and securing Isabella's protection until the state's emancipation deadline passed. But freedom came with a cost. She had left behind her husband Thomas and her other children, Peter, Elizabeth, and Diana. Dumont, ever spiteful, retaliated. In open violation of New York law, he illegally sold 5-year-old Peter to a speculator who trafficked the boy all the way to Alabama, deep into the violent heart of the Cotton South, where slave children disappeared into the soil like dropped seeds. Isabella's legal freedom was finally recognized on July 4th, 1827, but the holiday rang hollow. The state declared her free, but her family was still shattered. Thomas, by then ill and broken, could not leave Dumont's farm. Diana and Elizabeth remained enslaved, and Peter was gone, stolen from her arms, lost in the machinery of the slave trade. For all her new rights, Isabella carried the unbearable ache of maternal loss. She had been granted liberty, but not peace. But what came next was an act that would define her. Against all odds, Isabella went to war, not with fists, but with the law. In 1828, she filed a lawsuit in Ulster County to demand the return of her kidnapped son. It was unthinkable. A black woman, formerly enslaved, taking a white man to court in the United States. It had never been done, and yet she did it. With the quiet support of the Van Wagenens, she prepared her case and stood before a system not built to recognize her humanity, much less her motherhood. For months, she endured legal delays, denials, and the cold condescension of judges unaccustomed to seeing Black mothers fight for justice. But she would not back down. She had already walked through fire, and in the end, the court ruled in her favor. The man who had trafficked Peter was forced to return him. When the boy finally came home, shaken but alive, Isabella wept. She held him tightly, knowing that many other mothers, Black women across the South and North, would never get to do the same. That moment, that quiet victory in a courtroom that wasn't built for her, became the first time Isabella fought the system and won. She was no longer just a freed woman. She had become something else, a force. In that battle for Peter, she discovered the power of voice, of strategy, of moral clarity. She saw that justice could be won, even in a land steeped in its own contradictions. And deep inside her, something else began to stir. Not vengeance, not hatred, but purpose. The woman who had once lived nameless among sheep, traded for less than a plow, was beginning to see who she truly was. And though she did not yet know it, the world would soon know her name. At that point in time, her chains were finally gone, but Isabella Baumfree was not yet free. Legal emancipation had severed her from the bondage of men, but the years that followed brought a quieter kind of searching, one not of the body, but of the spirit. After winning back her son and securing her freedom, Isabella remained with the Van Wagenens for a time, working, reflecting, and wrestling with something deeper than grief or anger. The world had changed around her. She had a name, a place to rest, and even a small wage. But inside, she felt the weight of unfinished purpose, like she had survived for more than survival's sake. It was during these years that faith took root, not the formal, whitewashed religion practiced in slaveholder churches, but something raw and electrifying. Upstate New York was in the throes of the Second Great Awakening, a spiritual wildfire sweeping through towns and hillsides with open-air camp meetings, revivalist sermons, and ecstatic conversions. The region was being called the Burned-Over District for how thoroughly it had been set ablaze with new faiths and radical visions, Methodists, Baptists, Shakers, Adventists. Isabella attended the revivals not as a mere observer, but as someone being drawn into the flame. She listened, she wept, and she began to speak. God, she said, spoke to her directly. There was no booming voice from above. There was something quieter, more insistent, a stirring in the soul, a whisper in the marrow. She began to pray fervently, sometimes fasting, sometimes speaking aloud into the silence of her room. She found herself unable to rest. It was not just faith that consumed her, it was a calling. She later said that the Spirit called on her to preach the truth, not just gospel truth, but truth with a capital T. The truth about bondage, about suffering, about injustice wrapped in law and scripture. The voice she heard inside did not call her to peace. It called her to action. By 1843, the restlessness had become impossible to ignore. She was now in her mid-40s, older than most who began new journeys. But Isabella did not hesitate. She looked around at her few possessions, sold the last piece of furniture she owned, and bought a one-way ticket out of the city. Her son Peter, now reunited with her, stood by her side. And then, with her back to the life she had known, she did something few women, Black or white, ever dared to do in that era. She renamed herself. She chose the name Sojourner Truth. The meaning was deliberate. Sojourner, a traveler, one who moves from place to place with a purpose. Truth, what she was born to carry. The name was not a reinvention. It was a revelation. She had not become someone else. She had revealed who she always was. In casting off the name Isabella Baumfree, the name branded onto her by slavery and law, she made a sacred declaration. Her body was no longer property, and her voice would no longer be quiet. This was no stage name, no soft alias. It was a vow, clad in plain clothes, often a bonnet or headscarf tied neatly. Sojourner Truth set out across the northeastern states with no money, no church backing, and no printed tracts. only her voice, her Bible, and the burning conviction that God had sent her to speak. She entered towns as an unknown black woman and left as a force remembered. She walked roads alone, slept where she was invited, and when the moment came, she stood before strangers in churches, basements, meeting houses, and outdoor fields, and she preached. She had never learned to read or write. She needed no pulpit. She quoted scripture from memory, wrapped it in the rhythms of her own testimony, and delivered it with a strength that silenced rooms. Audiences sat spellbound, not because she was theatrical, but because she spoke from live truth. She described slavery in the first person. She told of having her child sold away, of being beaten, of working in fields with bleeding hands and a spine bent under the weight of another man's greed. She spoke without bitterness, but also without apology. In an era when white male preachers debated doctrine from behind ornate pulpits, Sojourner Truth stood barefoot on wooden floors and shook the conscience of the room. By the mid-1840s, she was no longer traveling only as a spiritual messenger. She had become something more, a crusader. Her speeches began to fuse religious revivalism with abolitionist fire. She joined the growing networks of black and white reformers who were calling for the end of slavery across the United States. But while many abolitionists spoke in the abstract about justice, liberty, equality, Truth's words cut deeper. Hers were not theories. They were wounds that still bled beneath her calm voice. She did not write manifestos. She became one. And everywhere she went, people remembered, not just her words, but her presence, her tall frame, wrapped in plain dresses, her deep voice, rising and falling like a sermon on Judgment Day, her piercing gaze, which could silence a heckler or calm a child. She was unlike anyone audiences had seen, and they knew it. She traveled not as an invited guest, but as a summoned witness. Her gospel was not confined to a denomination or a political party. It was the gospel of endurance, of fire surviving flood, of truth told plainly in a land built on lies. The world was beginning to know the name Sojourner Truth, and she was just getting started. By the time Sojourner Truth shed her old name and stepped into her purpose, America was on the verge of a reckoning. The 1840s marked a decade of unrest and awakening. Slavery was entrenched in the South and fiercely debated in the North. Into this battleground stepped a woman who had known its horrors firsthand. But Truth was not content to simply tell her story. She wanted to move hearts, stir consciences, and shift the very soul of the nation. In 1844, drawn by both spiritual curiosity and a hunger for justice, she moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, a small town with outsized ideas. There she joined the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, a utopian experiment of sorts, an integrated community of abolitionists, feminists, religious visionaries, and social reformers, all living and working side by side. They shared meals, labor, and ideals. For Truth, it was a rare haven, a place where black and white men and women spoke of equality not as fantasy, but as daily life. The commune welcomed her not as a servant, not as an oddity, but as an equal voice. It was there that she met William Lloyd Garrison, the firebrand publisher of The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave who had become one of the most powerful orators in the country. The three did not always agree. In fact, Truth and Douglass would later argue bitterly over tactics, but their respect was mutual. Garrison was struck by her authenticity. Douglass, despite his own eloquence, admitted that she could hold a crowd in a way no one else could. The association became her training ground. Truth spent her days working and her nights reading scripture aloud or speaking to fellow residents about morality, justice, and the meaning of freedom. Encouraged by her peers, she began to take her message beyond Northampton. From 1844 on, she hit the road, traveling from town to town across New England and upstate New York, often alone, speaking in dusty meeting houses and candlelit halls. During the week, she might attend religious revivals and camp meetings. On Sundays, she stood before abolitionist crowds, farmers, clergy, working-class mothers, raising her voice against the sin of slavery. She often faced hecklers, scoffing preachers, and hostile crowds, but her presence stilled them. Tall and commanding, wrapped in her bonnet and shawl, Sojourner Truth would walk to the front, place her hands on the lectern, and begin to speak. Her speeches were not polished, they were not rehearsed, but they were real. She told of children taken from mothers, of being beaten with rawhide, of watching her husband decay under forced labor. She invoked the wrath of God and the mercy of Christ in equal measure. She asked men if they could call themselves Christian, while defending a system that raped and sold women like herself. She asked women how they could pray for mercy, while ignoring the mothers torn apart by slavery's hand. And audiences listened. By the end of the decade, she had become a recognized name in reformist circles, not just for what she said, but for how she carried herself. She did not speak for pity. She spoke for power. She had never learned to write her own story, but she knew it needed to be told. So in the late 1840s, she began dictating her life to a trusted friend and ally, Olive Gilbert. It was a risk. Memoirs were rare for women, rarer for Black women, and unheard of from someone who could not read or write. In 1850, the book appeared, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth. It was a simple volume, free of rhetorical flourish, yet full of unshakable testimony. It told of her birth into slavery in New York, the theft of her children, the cruelties of John Dumont, the burning of her faith, and the divine call that had transformed her. Garrison's network helped publish and distribute it, and soon it was in homes and lecture halls across the North. The narrative did more than bring her modest income. It made her a symbol. Truth knew the power of image. Though she had no formal education, she understood branding in a way most reformers did not. She began commissioning photographs of herself, the popular carte de visite format of the time. But hers were not casual portraits. She posed knitting, her face calm, her posture dignified. Under the image, she had a caption printed, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." That shadow, her photograph, became her calling card. Sold for pennies, it helped fund her travels and her causes. It was clever, and it was subversive. In a world where Black women were treated as invisible, Truth sold her visibility. By the mid-1850s, she was one of the most photographed women in America. People collected her likeness not for novelty, but for what it represented. A survivor of slavery, now an activist, a preacher, a mother, and a warrior for human dignity. She never stopped speaking. She never stopped traveling. And everywhere she went, she reminded the world that the truth, no matter how inconvenient, could not be chained. By the turn of the 1850s, Sojourner Truth had already carved a name for herself as one of the most fearless voices in the abolitionist movement. But her mission would not end with slavery. She had seen too much, endured too much, to ignore another deep wound in the American soul, the unequal treatment of women, and not just white women, but women of every shade. She had lived the pain of both racism and sexism, and now, with the force of a storm gathering on the horizon, she stepped into the rising fight for women's rights. In 1850, Truth attended the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. There, she stood among a crowd of well-dressed reformers, lawyers, preachers, writers, and suffragists, many of whom had never worked in the fields or nursed babies while in chains. Truth spoke not with lofty theories, but with the raw power of lived experience. Her presence, already magnetic, commanded attention. She stood taller than most men, her voice deep, steady, and resolute. She had come to bear witness. That moment set the stage for what would become one of the most iconic addresses in American history. The following year, in 1851, Truth made her way to Akron, Ohio, for the state's Women's Rights Convention. The event was already tense. Many in the audience, including conservative clergy, bristled at the idea of women demanding political rights. Into this tension walked Sojourner Truth, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes burning with purpose. According to witnesses, she rose from her seat, stepped to the podium, and scanned the uneasy crowd. What came next has since echoed through time. That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman?
Nobody ever helps me in the carriages or over mud puddles or gives me in the best place. Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arms. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man can head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman?
She spoke of laboring in the fields like a man, suffering under the whip, and giving birth to children only to watch them be sold away, all without a flicker of mercy from the world that claimed to honor womanhood. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, she continued, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? Though historians later clarified that this famous refrain, ain't I a woman, was stylized in post-war retellings, the spirit of the speech is not in dispute. The accounts confirm her tone, her intensity, and the devastating logic of her words. In that room, her presence shattered every excuse offered to keep women out of politics, and every racist whisper that black women didn't belong in the conversation. Truth's speech cut across race, class, and gender. She didn't ask for permission. She reminded her audience of what they already knew deep down, that human dignity does not ask for acknowledgement, it demands it. The impact was immediate. Some sat in stunned silence, others wept. One attendee wrote that she spoke with such pathos, wit, and truth that she could not be forgotten. And indeed, she wasn't. But truth didn't pause to savor applause. For the next decade, she traveled tirelessly. She gave speeches at churches and conventions from New York to Michigan, often walking miles between towns when funds were low. Her voice, untrained but thunderous, could move crowds to tears or to action. She joined forces with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and other early suffragists, even as she held them accountable for the blind spots in their movement. Because for truth, the cause wasn't just about women's rights, it was about black women's rights too. While leaders like Frederick Douglass began arguing that black men should receive the vote first, fearing that pushing for women's suffrage too soon would stall progress, Truth stood firm. She challenged him publicly. Her message was unwavering. No race and no gender deserved to be left behind. Justice was indivisible. In private, she continued to live simply. She sold photographs of herself, spoke at fundraisers, and maintained a network of fellow reformers. She sometimes faced jeers, even violence, but she kept going. And those who saw her never forgot her. A woman journalist described her as carrying herself like an ancient queen, graceful, powerful, unknowable. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who would later interview her, called her a majestic figure and tried to capture in writing what so many others had only felt: the gravity, the fire, and the unmistakable truth that Sojourner Truth brought into every room she entered. This was not simply a woman of history. This was a woman of destiny. When the war between North and South erupted in 1861, Sojourner Truth did not hesitate. For her, it was the final reckoning with the monstrous institution that had haunted her every step. She had waited her whole life for the nation to confront slavery, and now that the Union had taken up arms, she intended to do her part, not as a soldier, not as a nurse, but as something perhaps even more powerful, a voice that could rally the conscience of a broken country. By then, she had settled in Battle Creek, Michigan, where she had lived since the late 1850s. Though in her 60s, she moved with urgency, speaking at public halls, gathering supplies, and urging black men to enlist. She reminded them that this was their war too, not just to preserve the Union, but to liberate their people once and for all. The Civil War opened a new chapter in Truth's long fight for justice. It was no longer about what might be. It was about what must be. Even her own bloodline answered the call. In 1863, her grandson James Caldwell joined the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first official black unit raised in the North. This was the same regiment that would later storm Fort Wagner in South Carolina, immortalized decades later in the film Glory. Truth proudly posed for a portrait holding James's photograph. She did not smile, but the fire in her eyes said more than words could. That same year, Sojourner traveled to Washington, D.C., where she began working with the newly formed Freedmen's Relief Association. This was no ceremonial position. She helped feed, clothe, and shelter thousands of formerly enslaved families who had nowhere else to turn. The capital was swarming with escaped slaves, men, women, and children, and the city's infrastructure was cracking under the weight. Truth helped hold it together. While in Washington, she secured an audience with President Abraham Lincoln himself. The meeting, held in 1864, became one of her most cherished memories. Lincoln had already read her biography. When she entered the White House, he greeted her with unexpected warmth, even inscribing her autograph book with his name. Though her companion Lucy Coleman would later scoff that Lincoln addressed Truth as Auntie, a term many found patronizing, Truth herself took no offense. She saw Lincoln as a tool of divine justice. "I was never treated by anyone with more kindness and cordiality," she said later, calling him the best president she had ever known. But the end of the war did not bring rest. After Appomattox, Truth poured herself into Reconstruction with the same fire that had fueled her abolition work. She joined efforts with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping formerly enslaved people transition into freedom. Many were homeless, jobless, landless. Truth saw clearly what others ignored. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed the body, but not yet the future. So she lobbied for land. In 1870, she launched a personal petition drive calling on Congress to grant Western lands to freedmen. She believed that if the government truly wanted to atone for slavery, it must give Black families the means to survive. Soil, not just promises. Truth collected thousands of signatures, delivered speeches from Michigan to Washington, and even sat once more in the White House, this time with President Ulysses Grant to press her case. Congress refused, but she had made them listen. That same year, Truth tested another frontier, the ballot box. During the presidential election of 1872, she strode to the polls in Michigan and attempted to vote. She was, of course, turned away. Black women were not yet welcome at the ballot, but her gesture wasn't about winning. It was about declaring her presence. She made clear that citizenship meant more than survival. It meant participation. And if the law excluded her, she would force the country to confront that exclusion head-on. Even in daily life, Truth defied injustice. In the mid-1860s, while living temporarily in Washington, she took a streetcar ride that nearly turned violent. The conductor ordered her off. Black women weren't allowed to ride. When she refused, he grabbed her and tried to physically remove her. But Sojourner Truth had faced down slave owners, courtrooms, and mobs. She would not be manhandled by a racist conductor. She sued and won. Her case helped lead to the desegregation of public transportation in Washington, D.C. As the 1870s wore on, her travels slowed. Her hearing began to fade. Her sight dimmed, but her spirit never did. She remained a beloved fixture in Battle Creek, living modestly, receiving visitors, and occasionally delivering short remarks at local gatherings. Friends described her as sharp, prayerful, and still fierce in debate. She spent her days with her family, telling stories and staying informed about national events. She knew that the rights she had fought for were not yet secure, and perhaps never would be in her lifetime. But she also knew she had planted something permanent in the American soil. On November 26, 1883, at the estimated age of 86, Sojourner Truth died peacefully in her home. The community mourned deeply. They buried her in Oak Hill Cemetery, alongside relatives and longtime friends. It was a cold morning, but the church was packed with mourners, Black and white alike, who came to honor a woman whose voice had once echoed across the nation. Before her death, Truth had already become a symbol. Her portrait circulated widely. Memorials had begun rising. In New Paltz, not far from where she had once escaped slavery with baby Sophia in her arms, neighbors planted a memorial tree to honor her. But her true legacy wasn't carved in stone or etched in metal. It lived on in every woman who refused silence, every man who stood for justice, and every generation that saw her life and whispered, "Ain't I a woman?" Sojourner Truth lived as her name commanded, a traveler who carried truth with her, from bondage to freedom, from sorrow to strength. And when she finally rested, the world she left behind was not the same one she had been born into. She had changed it word by word, mile by mile, truth by truth. Sojourner Truth's legacy is wide and deep. She left no monuments herself. She was more concerned with hearts than stones, but many have been erected in her honor over the past century. In Battle Creek, Michigan, a life-size bronze statue and memorial behind her gravesite commemorates Truth's life. In Western Massachusetts, the community of Northampton, where she once lived, organized a Sojourner Truth Memorial Statue Committee. In October 2002, a statue was unveiled in Florence, Massachusetts, set in a peaceful garden with plaques telling her story. In her native Hudson Valley, New York has moved to make her memory official. In 2024, Governor Kathy Hochul signed a law declaring November 26th Sojourner Truth Day statewide. That same act also created the Sojourner Truth State Park in Ulster County, the first state park to celebrate her, near her birthplace. Sojourner Truth's words live on as well as her likeness. Thousands of schools teach about her, and she appears in history textbooks, children's books, and documentaries. The very site of her most famous speech in Akron, Ohio, has been transformed. In 2024, the city opened the Sojourner Truth Legacy Plaza near the old church where she spoke, complete with a life-size bronze figure and engraved quotations. In 2025, Akron and Summit County officially designated May 29th, the anniversary of that 1851 speech, as Sojourner Truth Day, ensuring new generations remember her courage. Local educators and activists collaborate each year to honor her legacy, saying simply that Truth's story ignites a new generation of young leaders. Historians and biographers continue to study Truth's life as a vital chapter in American history. Scholar Nell Irvin Painter's acclaimed book, Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, explores her complex role in reform movements. Newspapers, magazines, and the Library of Congress likewise recognize Truth's impact as enduring. Even if the exact wording of some of her speeches has passed into legend, the essence of Sojourner Truth's message, that all people, regardless of race or gender, deserve freedom and respect, remains clear and true. Sojourner Truth's tenacity and faith in justice make her an American hero whose influence still guides us. In her own lifetime, Sojourner Truth never sought personal glory. She sold her shadow so others could benefit from the substance of her words. Yet by relentlessly speaking out, she became a symbol of moral clarity and courage. Her journey, from a child in slavery, through battles for liberty and equality, to an honored elder, spans the defining struggles of 19th century America. Today, wherever her story is told, on the memorials dotting Akron and New York, in history books and statues, Sojourner Truth is remembered not only as a former slave, but as a traveler of truth, an exemplar who carried her unshakable faith in justice into the world and changed it for the better. Thank you for staying with us through the remarkable life of Sojourner Truth. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it deepened your understanding of history, we invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more stories that deserve to be remembered. Your engagement helps keep these voices alive and brings forgotten legacies back into the light. Thank you again. We hope to see you on our next journey.